Good morning for this session's colleagues in Taipei. It's 7 a.m. in Taipei, and I'm Chen Zhirou, Jay Chen, the director of the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica. I'm also one of the committee members of this year's World Congress, working with Professor Michael Xiao in Taipei, with Bill and James at the University of Washington. And due to the pandemic, we have this kind of hybrid meeting. Now, I and 4 presenters of this panel are in Taipei. For some of our presentations, they are pre-recorded to be more efficient and to be clear-cut. Then, following the presentations, 4 presenters will be online for Q&A, and hopefully it will be smoothly working out. And the topic of this panel is Taiwan's contested sovereignty, historical origins, mechanisms, and consequences. And this panel takes the concept of contested sovereignty, and we hope to broaden the debate beyond the nationalism and state-building literature to examine how contested sovereignty impacts the society in different areas. And we hope to identify new research questions and problematics on Taiwanese society. And the 4 presenters study related issue of Taiwan's contested sovereignty from its historical origins in relation to nation-state building to its impacts on ethnic relations and political and economic development. And our presentations will be in this order too. And we have 4 presentations, and I will introduce them now. And the first is by Dr. Xie Hong, and he is the postdoc fellow at the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica. And the topic for his presentation today is Taiwan as a contested sovereign state. And the second presenter, Dr. Wang Fuchang, he is the research fellow at the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica. And his title is Political Transformation and Ethnic Relation in Post-War Taiwan, a Contested Sovereignty Perspective. And the third presenter is Wu Jiamin, and he is also the research fellow at the Institute of Sociology, Academia Sinica. His topic today is the war over identities. And the fourth presenter is Xie Feiyu Michelle, and she is the associate research fellow at our institute in Academia Sinica. And her topic today is Geopolitics, the developmental state and Taiwan's heavy industrialization in the 1970s. So let's welcome our 4 presentations, and I will start from the Dr. Xie Hong. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Hong Lavakao Xia. Today I'm going to present my paper entitled Taiwan as a Contested Sovereign State, exploring its endogenous origin from the perspective of nation-state building. To begin with, I would like to show 3 key features of this study. First of all, this is a study that takes sovereignty contested state as the dependent variable. Second, in this study, I would like to offer male development thesis to explain Taiwan's contemporary status of being a sovereignty contested state. Third, this study explored the origin of Taiwan's contemporary status from a historical endogenous perspective. And the main argument of this study is as follows. It is in the early 20th centuries that Taiwan has eventually arrived at a state of liminality, of becoming a modern nation state in its own right. However, because of the male development of the Taiwanese nation state formation, Taiwan had missed the boat twice in the mid-20th century. In 2020s, a new window seems to emerge in Taiwan's favor once again. We may reasonably speculate that this time Taiwan may have a higher odds on making itself a sovereign nation state, but there are still some worrisome uncertainties that cannot be ignored. So, I would like to present the differences between what is called the contentment thesis and what I want to offer in this study, the male development thesis. When it comes to the Taiwan's problematic statehood, that is a mainstream, if not dominant explanation for that. The explanation tends to ascribe Taiwan's failure to make itself a sovereign state to the obstruction, blockage, or constraints coming from without. That is to say, Taiwan's failure can be attributed to its misfortune of being contained by some external factors and or an unfavorable geopolitical environment. I call this widely accepted discourse the contentment thesis. And this contentment thesis has two main branches. One is the obviously an anti-China argument, and the other, in essence, an skepticism toward the United States. The gist of the former is to blame China for blocking or obstructing Taiwan from joining the international society as a normal member state, while the nature of the latter is a deep-rooted mistrust of the role and sincerity of the United States in dealing with Taiwan's international status. The contentment thesis, be it a China branding or the United States branding argument, is an observation made from an exogenous and a historical perspective. I agree that the contentment thesis represented a necessary and indeed intuitive perspective for us to consider Taiwan's problematic statehood. However, in my view, it can be complemented or even improved by what I put forth in this study, the male development thesis, for two reasons. First of all, the contentment thesis is in some way founded on a consciousness of shaking one's own responsibility, or to put it more precisely, a mentality of pinning on someone's hope on others pursuing a policy of goodwill. Second, with all due respect, I do not think the contentment thesis is logically rigorous. My point is that pardon me for using this metaphor of hatching out. As you can see, this is a clutch of eggs. And there are 2 of the 3 eggs have successfully hatched out. So you can see 2 chicks. My point is that we better ascertain that this egg, which has not hatched out yet, was actually fertilized. And this fertilized egg has grown into a tiny chick inside. Before we assert or complain that the egg shell is too hard, to the extent that preventing this tiny chick inside from hatching out. So in the same vein, before we explain Taiwan's problematic statehood by ascribing it to the external constraints, we better make sure that this egg is not empty inside. That is to say, there is actually a Taiwanese nation state that has formed within this egg. Okay? So let's come to the first phase of my argument. Thousands of years before the 17th century, Taiwan had been a purely Austronesian island. And between the 17th and 19th centuries, Taiwan has been turned into an island of dual constitution. What I mean dual constitution here had a twofold connotation. First, it implied a settler of regional duality in constitutional terms, and then a Chinese Austronesian duality in civilizational terms. It was in the first half of the 20th century that Taiwan had arrived at the state of liminality of becoming a modern nation state. This state of liminality implied a transitional phase in which the objective requirements for being established as a qualified nation state had been largely fulfilled, while the subjective qualities of establishing itself as a political subject in the form of nation state remained feeble, if not absent. So to put it bluntly, what was still lacking at that time was a group of elite who has determined to establish themselves as the leadership of a political subject with a clear and strong will to make Taiwan a modern sovereign state in its own right. I would like to give you another metaphor. In the first half of the 20th century, Taiwan resembled a 16-year-old teenager who had a well-grown figure while lacking a mental ability and self-awareness of acting as an adult. Therefore, being unable and even unwilling to seize opportunities, make responsible decisions, and wield power and influences as a sophisticated 40-year-old person would and could do. This is the reason why Taiwan will miss the ball twice in the mid-20th century. Let's turn to the second phase of my argument. Due to the substantial geopolitical change surrounding the island, the crisis of legitimacy concerning the rule over Taiwan had emerged twice in the mid-20th century. These 2 crises had rendered Taiwan 2 windows for leaping into the ranks of the normal sovereign states in the world. The first window came about within the short span of 2 years, immediately after the unconditional surrender of Japan to the Allies. As I mentioned, What was still lacking at that time was a group of elites who had determined to establish themselves as the leadership of a political subject. In this transient window, the undetermined settler elite in Taiwan had let the opportunity slip through their fingers twice, indeed. The first time was the aborted initiative of Taiwan independence in 1945. During the last 2 months under Japanese rule, a handful of the most prominent settler elite, together with 2 Japanese military officers, had attempted proposing a grouping of Taiwan independence. But this proposal was readily aborted before it's been made known to the public. Mainly because the slight objection from the last Governor General of Taiwan, Ando Rikichi. And what is even more discouraging is that in 1947, the Committee for Settling February 28 incidents, 228事件, in which most notable settler elite on the island were recruited, did not come to a conclusion to make themselves the leadership of a new political subject, whatever it might be called, Taiwan or Formosa, but only think of seeking a higher degree of autonomy under the political framework of a Greater China. The second window emerged in the context of the United States' strategic shift from contending to engaging Communist China in the 1970s. The so-called decades of diplomatic crisis for the KMT-dominated Republic of China. This time, the undetermined settler elite have no say in this window. It was no doubt the immigrant leadership played a major role in it. There are at least 2 insiders from the ruling group, Yang Xikun and Lei Zhen, had advised the highest leadership to turn Taiwan into a self-sufficient sovereign state under the name of either the Chinese Republic of China or Taiwan or the Sino-Democratic Republic of Taiwan. This second window was missed as well because of the reluctance of the immigrant leadership to take this advice in fear of the destruction of their rule over Taiwan. As a result, the political aspiration of establishing Taiwan as a sovereign state in its own right have not turned into reality within these 2 transient windows. So that's turn to the surface of my argument. As time comes to the 2020s, a new window in Taiwan's favor seems to emerge once again in the changing geopolitical situations. We may reasonably speculate that this time Taiwan may have a higher odds on making itself a sovereign state because the democratization of Taiwan since the 1990s has pushed forward the Taiwanese nation-state formation to a much more mature stage compared to that of the earlier 2 windows. Over the last 3 decades, Taiwan has witnessed the first ever accordance between the effective rule of a Taiwan-wide de facto state and the making of a Taiwan-wide emerging community as a nation. even though Taiwan has higher ed at this time, but there are still some worrisome uncertainties which would very likely loom large in the coming critical junctures. The worrisome uncertainty originate in ultimate questions. To what extent the immigrant state could be transformed into a Taiwanese nation state? What are the limits of this largely bloodless transformation? Or put it differently, given that the immigrant state had been inherited and reframed so as to be naturalized to the newly formed Taiwanese nation in the process of democratization, will we find in great pain and too late in a difficult situation of war that in the final analysis, the deep state of the KMT ROC will be incompatible with the existential national interest of the Taiwanese nation and could not be co-opted after all. And if this is the case, what will be the consequences? I will end my presentation here and leave these two questions open to all of you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor to take part in this important event and share my thought with you. The subject I will discuss today is highly related to Taiwan's current situation, and yet from a more historical perspective. The purpose of this paper is to elaborate on relations among contested sovereignty, ethnic relations, and democratization in Taiwan, particularly before 1990s. I will divide my talk into 6 parts as shown on the slide. Let me begin by quoting 2 passages that I think clearly demonstrate the research question or the puzzle of this study. The first is by Lee Kiam-hok, a Formosa nationalist who published an article in Foreign Affairs in 1957, in which he said, quote, "Before pressure to admit Communist China to the United Nations becomes irresistible, the United States should relieve itself of the anomaly of supporting a government which is held to be sovereign where it exerts no authority, and which lacks sovereign where it does." End quote. The second quote is made by Mike Pompeo, former U.S. Secretary of State who visited Taiwan on March 2022 in the shadow of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to show his support for Taiwan, in which he urged, I quote, "The United States government should immediately take necessary and long overdue steps to do the right and obvious things. That is, to offer the Republic of China, Taiwan, Americans diplomatic recognition as a free and sovereign country." I think he made the same statement again just a few days ago. The 2 passages make it 65 years apart, review the long history of Taiwan's contested sovereignty problem and its current predicament. The historical origin of this problem, according to existing research, has to do with the fact that the ROC rejected the dual representation solution to the Chinese representation problem in the UN in 1971. The puzzle was, why did the ROC do that? Unlike most international relations study in English literature or historical study in Chinese literature, this paper will focus on the dynamic of domestic ethnic politics in Taiwan after 1949. First, the development of contested sovereignty problem in Taiwan. After the establishment of the PRC in October 1949, the former Soviet Union began to demand that the UN China Sea occupied by the ROC should be given to the PRC due to the change of regime after 1950. With strong support by the US, the ROC was able to win the voting on China Sea quite easily throughout the 1950s. However, after the mid-1960s, many UN members, including those who supported the ROC, considered it unjust to exclude the PRC, a country with a billion population, from the UN, but were equally hesitate to admit the PRC by expelling the ROC. The ROC finally lost the battle in 1971. The China representation problem in the UN has important impacts on the ROC's domestic politics after it moved to Taiwan in 1949, because the KMT government had to rebuild the relocated central government to support its claim of being the only legitimate government of whole China. As Taiwan was only one of the 36 provinces of the ROC, the proportion of Taiwanese in the central government was naturally quite slow. In fact, there was no Taiwanese cabinet member or justice in the judicial yuan in 1948. After the reorganization in the early 1950s, the number of Taiwanese in top position of the central government stayed basically the same, except for a new cabinet member and a new justice. The situation did not change until 1969. What is more, the term of the elected representative in the three central government organs was extended indefinitely until new election can be held again in the Chinese mainland. As the 1 million and more mainland migrants only made up about 40% of Taiwan's population, this reorganization created a political structure dominated by the mainlander. Such a structure of ethnic inequality was challenged domestically by Taiwanese and some mainlanders before 1971. For instance, Lei Zhen of the Free China in the late 1950s and Peng Mingmin in 1964. Both of them were sentenced to prison or put under house arrest. Also, the battle for keeping the UN China Sea became increasingly pessimistic after France recognized the PRC in 1965. In response, the KMT government under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek allowed 11 additional legislators and 18 members of the National Assembly for Taiwanese, which were elected in 1969. This additional seat was supposed to reflect the population growth and administrative adjustment of Taiwan since 1948. And the number of seats was calculated according to the rule designed in the 1947 ROC Constitution. The new added member served the same term as the incumbents, that is, until the Chinese mainland can be recovered. After 1971, external crisis was even more severe, which include losing the UN China Sea in 1971 and the U.S. diplomatic recognition of the PRC in 1978, while rising challenges for democratic reform were made by the intellectual in 1971, the Taiwanese Political Review in 1975, and especially by the Formosa in 1979. The KMT under the new leadership of Jiang Jingguo responded in a very different way. First, Jiang began to promote more Taiwanese to high-profile central government positions after he became the premier in 1972. This policy was jokingly referred to as 催台金, which was evidently shown in the increase of Taiwanese in the cabinet and other executive positions in the central government organ. The Taiwanese cabinet member increased to 6 in 1972, compared to only 1 or 2 in the past, and again to 9 in 1978, when Jiang Jingguo became the ROC's president, and to 12 in 1984, when he was elected to his second term of presidency by the National Assembly. Also, Taiwanese were assigned to hold the deputy executive position, that is, 副院长, in 4 out of 5 branches of the ROC central government after 1972. Second, the KMT government also began to hold regular elections for more and new supplementary seats of legislator and member of the National Assembly after 1972. The number of legislators open for election, for example, were 36 to 38 during 1972, 75, and 78, based on a newly designed formula. It should be noted that the 1978 election was suspended after the U.S. broke its official diplomatic relations with the ROC. When the election was resumed in 1980 after the outbreak of Kaohsiung incident in 1979, the number rose to 70 based on a new formula, which was also applied to the 1983 and 1986 election with 71 and 73 seats. The supplementary seat elected after 1972, however, was open to all citizens in Taiwan and served a 3-year term. Despite the continuing increase of Taiwanese in the ROC central government, the Chinese representation seemed to be carefully maintained in 2 census. First, there seemed to be some sort of ceiling for the Taiwanese proportion in these top government positions. Before Jiang Jingguo passed away in 1988, the highest proportion was 36% in the member of control yuan, followed by 1/3 in the cabinet, 1/4 of the legislature. Second, the KMT government also insists on some forms of Reserve C representing the mainland provinces when reforming the central government organs. As Taiwanese made up about 85% of the population, some Taiwanese elite was dissatisfied with the tokenistic participation in the central government and hence demand full democracy. On the other hand, young mainlander elite were also complaining about their political prospect in Taiwan, as their chances of winning the supplementary C elections was increasingly limited, as we have shown in the Table 3, and that more and more important political position seems to be reserved for Taiwanese. Some second-generation mainlander began to construct their ethnic minority consciousness and favor Reserve C representing mainland provinces in the new Congress. This new demand not only triggered new ethnic conflict among the younger generation, but also become the most important barrier in Taiwan's democratization transformation. However, after Jiang Jingguo passed away in 1988, mainlander candidate did very well in the 1989 legislature election by successful ethnic mobilization and no longer insisted on Reserve C for the Chinese provinces. The KMT under Li Denghui's leadership was able to implement democratization transformation and gradually reform the central government organ to represent only the territory and population it effectively ruled after 1949. Let me make a quick conclusion remark. However, ethnic conflict intensified during and after Taiwan's democratization due to clashes between the Chinese versus the Taiwanese national imagination after 1990s. For instance, the interpretation of Taiwan's historical relations with China, Japan, and the US, Taiwan's current national identity, and Taiwan's future relations with the emerging China continue to become focuses of new ethnic problem in the new millennium. Although the democratization resolved the old ethnic politics of distribution, the new ethnic politic of identity remain the biggest challenges in Taiwan. In this aspect, the legacy of ethnic tension caused by the Chinese representation problem in the United Nations since the 1950s can still be found in Taiwan's contemporary contested sovereignty problem. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, good afternoon. Identity politics about Taiwan is nothing novel. Many scholars have produced fruitful research, and the general trends has been studied quite well. So what's new about Taiwanese politics? The case of Taiwan is unique, but not singular. Many other countries can be compared with Taiwan. One is Ukraine. Russia's invasion sent a wake-up call to the world. And Taiwan was mentioned by global media the very day Russia launched all-out attack on Ukraine. Ukraine has a clear and unique national identity. It is a sovereign state recognized by international society, but it is still under constant threat of a self-proclaimed aggressive fatherland. Both Ukraine and Taiwan face a problem of statelessness. This concept was defined by Linz and Steppen, 1996, more than 2 decades ago. Put succinctly, the statelessness problem means, quote unquote, no secure democracy, no secure statelessness, which means sovereignty, no democratic consolidation. So Taiwan has gone through democratic consolidation, and Ukraine's road to democracy has been much bumpier than Taiwan's. Russia sways its neighbors in their political development. The same is true for China in East Asia region. Both Taiwan and Ukraine are at the forefront of an irredentist empire in respective regions. The imperial center constantly threats the autonomy and freedom of its peripheries. In this way, Taiwan and Ukraine are typical cases for sovereignty contested state. The contestation not only brings fears of democratic backslide, but also makes the smaller countries' statelessness at peril. So the puzzle for us is as follows. How do authoritarian powers shape the identity configuration of their smaller neighbors? How does external threat interact with identity politics? And specifically, how has the meaning of independence changed under external threat? My argument in this paper is that the character of Taiwanese independence, Taidu, so to speak, has transformed over time. It has been changing from introvert to extrovert orientation. I borrow these terms from psychology. The KMT ROC as an emigre regime was an obstacle to democracy and self-determination of the people. So Taiwanese independence means to eliminate the emigre regime. But since the onset of democratization, its meaning has transformed into defending Taiwan against the external threat from China. In other words, this process is one from internal democratic consolidation to external consolidation. We can briefly compare Taiwan and Ukraine in terms of identity formation to bring up the changing meaning of independence. In both cases, as in all sovereignty contested states, identity, language, and history are major areas of contestation. The indigenous national identity, as you can see in this figure, has continued to grow and consolidate. Both cases are noted for the mixed identity issue, but the difference can be easily seen. In Ukraine, the mixed identity of Ukrainian and Russian is very slim, even lower than the Russian identity. You can observe the lowest gray line. And by contrast, in Taiwan, the mixed identity has been substantial and fluctuated over time. The general trends toward indigenous Taiwanese identity are clear and steady, but the subtle change of the meaning of independence, Taidu, cannot be shown intuitively in the figure. It needs interpretation. First, let's look at the changing stances on Taiwan's status held by KMT and DPP respectively. The table shows a brief chronicle the Kuomintang has undergone 3 phases, basically, regarding the legal status of ROC and Taiwan. From stage 1, the ROC representing the whole China, to stage 2, abolishing the temporary provision of the Constitution, which is 临时条款 in Chinese, which means Taiwan and the mainland are 2 separate political entities, and the 2 stage, finally to stage 3, cooperating with the Chinese Communist Party. So both KMT and CCP, Kuomintang and Zhonggong, vow to uphold the so-called 1992 consensus and deemed Taidu their common enemy. In its turn, you can see from the right column, in its turn, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, has changed its platform from seeking the Republic of Taiwan to a new resolution that claims Taiwan is already an independent sovereign state, and any change of the status quo must be subject to referendum. This happened on the eve that the DPP would win the presidential power for the first time in 2000. Against this background, we can further look at the following figure. In this figure, I try to indicate the intersection of the 2 directions of Taidu movement. During the authoritarian era, the KMT asserted that Taiwan was a part of China, and because of the ongoing Chinese Civil War, and the country was under martial law and temporary provisions, 临时条款, the election of the parliament was impossible. Therefore, to democratize the country, to democratize Taiwan, you must dismantle the KMT ROC emigre regime at the same time. So this Taidu movement was inward looking, essentially. At that time, the threat of communist China was real for the KMT. It was a life and death struggle for them. Yet, for the democracy and independence advocates alike in the island, the Red Terror was an ideological disguise of the KMT's White Terror. 1996 was a significant year. Taiwan had its first direct election of the president, and the PRC attempted to disrupt it by military means. This episode brought about several consequences. First, direct election of the president embodies the principle of popular sovereignty. The CCP feared it so much as to launch a missile exercise, missile threat. Secondly, CCP's use of military force proved that the communist threat is existential, and the CCP's goal is to prevent Taiwan from becoming independent and democratic. As a result, Taiwan must face up to the China problem, or China factor, which means that the CCP-PRC is not merely a menace to democracy, but also to self-determination and independence. In retrospect, I will argue that the 1996 military threat by Beijing was a transformative event in terms of William's rule. It triggered dynamic of Taidu from introvert to extrovert orientation. If the ROC is on the way of democratization and indigenization in terms of Wakabayashi's proposition, 中华民国本土化, it, which means ROC, shouldn't be regarded as an emigre regime. Now that China's threat is existential, you must deal with it. The obstacle to Taidu comes from China's blockade. This is clearly perceived by the people in Taiwan. Moreover, Beijing began to apply influence operations toward Taiwan in the following years. Taiwan faced democratic backsliding due to Beijing's sabotage. This process coincided with the rise of China. Now the PRC can threaten Taiwan with forces. It can also buy Taiwan with its accumulated wealth. This has given birth to the China Factor research agenda from Taiwan. At this stage, the Tianandu generation with natural-born Taiwanese identity have emerged. They accept the idea of Republic of China, Taiwan, a new formula to resolve the contradiction of the ROC and the Taiwan. Despite that the ROC is no longer connected with the KMT, its constitution, 中华民国宪法, is nonetheless a foreign import. The idea of ROC Taiwan is a legacy of former President Li Denghui. Now it's utilized by the DPP. The Tianandu generation do not oppose the use of ROC national flag, a phenomenon very, very hard to imagine for the older generations of Taidu. For the CCP, Taidu means succession of the Chinese nation state, and the ROC Taiwan is no doubt a type of Taidu. In Taiwan, some pro-China citizens renounce the indigenous regime, the indigenous democratic regime, and challenge Taiwan's status. This form of opposition contingent on the blessing of the fatherland could jeopardize the young democracy. One of the most insidious external threats comes from some mafia-linked parties cultivated by the CCP. China's operations aim to absorb Taiwan's territory and sovereignty as its ultimate goal. I define the operations with three modes: external coercion, penetration from within, and eroding the political identity boundaries. As Beijing constantly contests Taiwan's sovereignty, it has largely targeted national identity. For the sake of time, I will just give you two examples. The first is supporting the 1992 consensus campaign in the national elections. The most spectacular one happened in 2012. Another example is entertainers forced to disavow their Taiwanese identity and embrace Chinese identity for their markets in China. This kind of anti-Taidu game has become a witch hunt in China. Now my conclusive remarks. I will just make several points. First, over the years, the character of Taidu has transformed from dismantling the KMT immigrant regime into defending the external threats of the PRC. This process is what I've called one from introversion to extroversion in collective identity construction and reconstruction. The Tianandu generation indicates this extrovert development. Therefore, the meaning of Taidu is neither fixed nor fluid. Its character is shaped jointly by a series of historical moments, including democratization, the China factor, and the geopolitics. Furthermore, China intends to manipulate Taiwan's identities, but action leads to reaction. Its influence operations brought about unintended consequences. People become more aware of the CCP's united front strategies and information warfare, and the people are mobilized to protest the Chinese interference. In the end, the Taiwanese identity has been forming up. The more interplay with the PRC, the more Taiwanese consolidate their national identity. In a nutshell, the metamorphosis of Taidu is in large part a product of the PRC's contestation against Taiwan. Thank you.
I I would like to motivate my presentation by first starting with some of the recent events in Taiwan. This is President Tsai's visit to the China Steel Corporation, Zhonggang, in 2017. And in this visit, she made the following remark. She talks about the importance of Zhonggang in Taiwan's economy and how it related to Taiwan's industrial upgrading and transformation, such as the 5+2 innovation industries and building indigenous vessels in national defense and etc. And how that it's crucial in Taiwan's transformation. And just for reference, the talks about 5+2 innovation programs emphasize on national defense and aerospace and also machineries. And here you also see the 6 core strategic industries that often emphasized in talk by the government. And here is in relating to national defense. These are the pictures that went viral recently and talking about President Tsai's visit to shipbuilding facility, and also her emphasis on domestic shipbuilding program strengthen national defense, and visit with F-16 maintenance center as indicator for developing aerospace industry. So for anyone who is familiar with the history of Taiwan's 1970s development, this seems like a deja vu. So how do we make sense of the state's recent quest for developing a self-reliant defense and innovation in strategic industries? Are we rediscovering the developmental state in present-day Taiwan? I suggest that the experience of the 1970s might provide some clue. So what this paper would do is to present a geopolitics thesis that explains the rise of the developmental state and its involvement, its commitment to science and technology development and innovation. I'll do so by looking at Taiwan's HCI drive, heavy industrialization drive in the 1970s. 2 cases will be examined. First, the establishment of Taiwan's first modern integrated steel mill, which is China Steel Corporation, Zhonggang. Second was talking about the self-reliance defense industry that set forth the military and civilian industry nexus. So just quickly wrap up on the literature on state-led development. Like many people in Taiwan would talk about the past Taiwan miracle, focusing on the great man thesis, focusing on the strong leaders or enlightened technocrats. But the problem with that literature say little about why the state is committed to economic development. Or often we imply that democratization means the end of this developmental strong state paradigm. So, but then this raises the question why this would imply the withdrawal of the state in managing the economy. This raised the question why the recent events would suggest otherwise. The state has continued to be present in the economic affairs and commit to development. So here I bring in back the geopolitics thesis and explain that how geopolitics helped the state to involve in industrialization. And part of the argument is that interstate competition would give rise to state involvement in industrialization that give rise to similar industrial structure in countries among late industrializers, such as if you think of Japan and South Korea. And Cold War geopolitics, for instance, also led to state intervention in science and technology race. For instance, you think of a U.S. Marshall Plan and how that impact on the European scientific community, or even within the U.S., the DARPA programs give rise to the semiconductor industry. And using Taiwan as a case, the geopolitics here is expressed in contested sovereignty, which I'll explain in a minute what I mean by this. And just to make the point about transnational connections here, focusing on the different knowledge flows, ideas, networks among different actors, in addition to talking about formal relations between state organizations. So contested sovereignty in the Taiwanese context in the 1970s, first talking about the diplomatic setbacks since the 1970s. 1971, Taiwan lost its seat to the UN, so the end of free China. And lost major allies such as Japan. So the corresponding events people talk about is the 10 major construction project in response to 1972 oil crisis or industrial deepening, or as Jiang Jingguo's effort to gain support from the local Taiwanese after losing external legitimacy. Among the 10 projects, the steel plant is one of them, which I will get to in the next minute. So talking about building the first modern integrated steel plant, I should make it clear that it's not a result of 1970 that happened, but actually the discussion started in 1950s. There's always been a long history discussion of building a steel industry in the consideration of national defense and security. And also, I think by default, a lot of developing countries in the process of industrialization wants to have a steel industry. But funding agencies tend to frown upon those initiatives because often led to debt crisis in developing countries. So to make the long story short, a long history of discussion. And so by 1969, U.S. Steel Corporation was considered as a candidate. Initially, the contact was with Japan and West Germany. But part of the problem was always about financing and also the risk involved, because given Taiwan's small market and also the inputs was minimal and so not economical to build a steel plant. So countries were less likely to fund the project. And U.S. Steel initially wanted to invest and was closest to invest, but they withdraw because it was seen as an economic justifiable investment. At the same time, by 1969, 1970, it was able to find foreign investors because countries were establishing relationship with the PRC that prevent doing business with ROC. So there was a lot of pressure from those PRC to prevent countries establishing business relationship with ROC. Austria, this company, Austria Vost, came along as a candidate in the spring of 1971, and it proposed to invest 20% of share out of total investment, and also it will provide technical and consulting services and provide financing by the Austrian government. And part of a good reason that this came through was the geopolitics of the 1971. For instance, it was chosen because it was considered as a neutral country, a reliable partner, even though it had established ties with the PRC. But you couldn't find other financing from other European countries. And just to show that the agreement actually with the company was finalized on November 2nd, 71, right after Taiwan lost its seat with UN. So it was supposed to, having this contract supposed to boost morale while all countries abandoning Taiwan. However, the deal collapsed within a year. What happened was that the following year, Taiwan government, the China Steel Corporation company accused Austrian overpriced bidding and forming a cartel with other European companies, and so terminated the contract with on technical consulting services, and the Austrian in turn withdrew its investment. And partly there was also the problem of delay in financing from the Austrian government, and the Austrian response to the Taiwanese account was saying that they said they think the problem has to do with Austrian shilling. The U.S. currency was depreciated 30% that year, so made the Austrian equipment hard to compete. And also they think it was political because U.S. pressured Taiwan to take on the U.S. company. And I think from the declassified document from Ministry of Foreign Affairs suggests that there is also a lot of pressure from China to stop Austria establishing this business with Taiwan, which we can talk to more in the during the discussion should people be interested. But so anyway, to make the long story short, the solution after 1973 was that Taiwan went back to the U.S. and contracted with the U.S. Steel Engineering and Consulting Company, which is a subsidiary of the U.S. Steel Corporation. And so now it's just basically asking them to provide engineering and consulting services. And this project was financed by U.S. Export and Import Bank, backed by the ROC government. And because of this, China Steel Corporation became a state-owned enterprises. And the finance was to finance the the purchase of U.S. goods and services. And so in the same time, it's not a turnkey. Just want to emphasize, it's not a turnkey equipment construction. But Zhonggang sourced globally for equipment, while the design and the training consultation came in from the U.S. So those are some documents that talk just to show you the process of building this first modern integrated steel plant. And this is the contract agreement with Austria. And the declassified document from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and talking about how Austria became a choice, with a neutral European country is a good and reliable partner. So just let me quickly talk about the second case. The second critical juncture would be 1978, when Taiwan lost diplomatic ties with the U.S. And people often associate developmental state in Taiwan with 1979, science and technology development. That's when government started to invest in R&D, and Taiwan's the narrative about Taiwan moved to the high-tech sector and the rise of the IT and semiconductor industries, etc. But what's often being overlooked was actually also 1979 was the launch of heavy industrialization and strategic industries to support and realize the so-called self-reliant national defense, which was actually a top priority of that science and technology program in the context of waning of U.S. commitment. So basically, again, it was geopolitics-induced industrialization. And for the first time, military connect with civilian industries began to be widely discussed in the policy circle. So this narrative is talk about not often people just talk about industrial upgrading and second ISI, but I think this complements the other half of the story. So here is the show you the original science and technology development plan. If you look at closely, actually when they talk about the goal of the program, it's actually to strengthen, the priority goal is strengthen national defense industry, develop new type of weaponry, and establish a self-reliant national defense program. But most people are focusing on the establishment of Hsinchu Science Park and the establishment of IT industry. So those are the actors in defense industry. For example, Zhongshan Institute of Science and Technology, Zhongshan 科学研究院. It was established in 1969, but prior its mission was more about to take, military defense to take over China. But I think in the context of late 1970s, it was actually building Taiwan's defense industries is to preserve Taiwan's place in the world, existence in the world. So it's a very different orientation. So, and you have a key actor bring in China Steel and China Shipbuilding and also aerospace, Hanxiang, AIDC into the networks of building local defense capacities. And also what needs to be done here was people talk about, bring foreign experts. So Taiwan can gain access to knowledge that it could not have done through formal channels. And I think we're all very familiar with the case of the semiconductor industry, the case of Morris Chang and went to ITRI and how it set up TSMC and etc. And in the case of the defense industry, David Huang was crucial. He was the first invited back as a PI of Tiangong missile project and it was crucial in modernizing the research infrastructure of the Defense Research Institute to be on par with the U.S. And his background was an MIT graduate and worked in Rocketdyne in the aerospace industry in the U.S. and then came back overseas Chinese who didn't have any connection with Taiwan prior. And then and he was a founder of Taiwan's Indigenous Defense Firefighter, was critical in developing that project, IDF. So just to conclude, I want to recap what the geopolitics thesis of the developmental state can offer. First, it goes beyond the conventional dead-end debate of state versus market, and also our authoritarian state developmental state. So by bringing this geopolitics thesis, it helps us to understand the continuity of the role of the state's involvement in the economy and also in innovation initiatives. And it's because of geopolitics thesis can explain better the continuity and the dynamic of present-day global dynamic. And just to conclude, last point was this also bringing the contested sovereignty thesis might help us to explain why Taiwan and Korea differ despite sharing many similarities. And I think that Taiwan, the contested sovereign statehood constrained Taiwan's choice in direction of science technology development, and that tied Taiwan further into the orbit of the U.S. in technology access and flow of knowledge, whereas Korea was often served as a model of the latecomers, and Taiwan present a very different direction for development. So I'll conclude my talk here, and I thank you for your attention.
Is actually standing live in the middle of the night to answer questions. So the floor is open. I think I'll go for Shelley. She had her hand up quickly. Go ahead.
You want me to?
Yes, I thank you for reminding everyone with a question should come up to the podium, because then our online audience can hear you.
Hello, friends in Taiwan. Thank you so much for these very interesting papers. I just have a question for Professor Wang, and that is, how do the 全国不分区 seats fit into the analysis that you're making? Everybody forgets that in the early 1990s, 30 seats were added to the legislature for the purpose of representing basically the people in mainland China. I just looked it up, actually, and oh, shoot, my phone is going to let me down. But the law basically says these 30 seats, the purpose of them is to represent people who are not, who are neither, 全国不分区30人. They're people who are not 侨民. So there's seats reserved for 侨民, and then there are seats reserved, or they're the seats elected from Taiwan. And I just wonder whether that's another example of an institutional mechanism that was set up for the purpose of guaranteeing at least some amount of representation for mainlanders in the legislature, and whether that fits, Professor Wang, with your very interesting thesis about the sort of series of things that the KMT did to try to keep mainlanders in the government. So that was my question.
Should I answer the question now, or we will take a couple of questions?
Go ahead, Professor Wang, go ahead.
Okay, the design for 全国不分区 in the legislature was proposed by the KMT as a form of representing the mainland provinces. But in reality, when it was actually implemented in the early 1990s, the representation for the mainland Chinese provinces was not the most important consideration when it actually happened. This was the original idea in 1986 or 1987, when the KMT, after they feel some pressure about people's resistance on maintaining Chinese representation in the new Congress. So they decided that this formula will no longer be operating. However, 全国不分区 was still used after early 1990 to do that. But of course, in its original design, that's supposed to be some remedy for having Chinese representation in reality. Most parties did not nominate people on the basis of their provincial representation. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman here, I'm sorry, yes, you, sir, come on up. Yeah.
Hi, my question is for Michelle. Yeah, and as far as I know, after Second World War in Taiwan, many of the first generation of the industrialists in manufacturing industry are Taiwanese 本省人. And my question is, I want to know the ethnic background of the people, the leader involving in heavy industry, and in industry related to the Taiwan's defense. This is my question. Thank you.
Should I answer now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sure.
I think that the answer is pretty straightforward, as most Taiwanese would assume. The elites and the technocrats who were involved in this, reading from the archives, are mostly the KMT mainlander elite who came from China. And a lot of them share similar background. They went to similar, for example, a lot of them, especially in heavy industries, many of them went to Wuhan University in China. And that's how the connection formed. So in that sense, yes, it was mostly mainlanders' background.
Okay, more questions? Actually,
Thank you. I have hello, Professor Cheng and Professor Wu, all the friends there. I have a question, one for Professor Wu and also one for Michelle. One for Professor Wu is comparing Taiwan and Ukraine's identities is actually a very interesting subject, but I want to hear more what is the basis of comparison in a more nuanced detail on the Ukraine side. Because I was doing more on the Taiwan-Ukraine's comparison in a sense of the international relations perspective, but it would be very interesting to know what's your perspective on Taiwan-Ukraine's domestic identities, diversity within. So for Professor Wu is on that. A quick question for Michelle is, if one look ahead of Taiwan's developmental state and science governance, and I just wonder your perspective as a science innovation policy, a state-owned enterprises, will it be competitive enough? Because as we will be interesting to see that how the the government want and push us a developmental states plan, but the innovation and the creation, it's kind of more of the spontaneous and wanted to be more encouraging for most of the startup companies. So just wonder a penny of your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this question. Can everybody hear me?
yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for mentioning this question about the comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan. I just want to make two short points. One is, why do we have to compare Taiwan and Ukraine, and what is the advantage of comparing them? The first point is that the geopolitical situation between Taiwan and Ukraine is quite similar, given the recent international relations changing in the Taiwan Strait and also in the Ukraine region. And you know that Taiwan has been under a double or triple pressures in this geopolitical environment, under the threat of China, and also the US plays a very important role in the region. So Taiwan has to choose a stance, whether you want to come closer to China or you want to lean to US and as a member of the Democratic Alliance of the world. And we know that during the Ma Ying-jeou government in 2008 and 16, the Ma government tilted more to China and that brought him a lot of pressures from the popular protests in Taiwan. And after the Sunflower Movement, the geopolitical situation also changed in the following years. Then Taiwan reoriented its external orientation toward more to the West and the U.S. And that kind of situation applies to Ukraine too. I just give you this example. When Zelensky was just elected as president of Ukraine, he was regarded as kind of president who is more pro-Russia. But as the geopolitical situation plays out, eventually he comes to support the idea of joining NATO. Okay, so that kind of new decision creates tensions with Russia. So that is the major point that I want to bring up, that we can compare Taiwan and Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
So let me respond to the.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Let me respond to the question on whether or not it's appropriate for the state to be involved in the innovation program. I think point one, it's in the 70s. The end outcome looks like it's state-owned enterprises, but actually the story I was trying to tell was actually. It was not initially. It was not supposed. Like for example, those heavy industry were not supposed to be state-owned enterprise. It was supposed to be private enterprises, and it became state-owned enterprises because the result of geopolitics, that there's no other foreign investor were willing to get to chip in the investment, and state ended up had to pick up the shares. That's point one. But that doesn't. But what's the story I'm trying to tell here is to go beyond that state versus market. Even now, you look at those enterprises are mostly privatized, but the state still has some involvement and share. So the point here is not about whether it's state or market, let private industry let it do its own things, but it's about how geopolitics or this external competition that kind of bring the particular kind of configuration of that connect the state into this kind of project. It could go by private sectors, but the state play a coordinating role or some kind of providing the infrastructural background, like sowing the seeds in letting this take off. And I think that's the idea I have. Even if you look at Hanxiang, AIDC, it's actually a private enterprise now, even though it has a strong connection to the government procurement and etc. Yeah.
Hello, I have a question for Michelle. So from 1950 to 1965, Taiwan received 100 million US aid each year. So and this money was spent in heavy industry and governmental reorganization. So I'm wondering if we take this into consideration, what would make the heavy industrial development at the time different from nowadays? The Tsai Ing-wen's heavy industrial development you just mentioned. Thank you.
Okay. I think actually you raise a good point. Even I think the USA, they set up a lot of the foundations, building up a lot of infrastructure programs. And even the steel industry, they were entertain the idea of using US aid to build the steel industry, but that was vetoed by the US all along, given this. But I think the key difference from my narrative, you look at early 60s to since the 70s, the key differences in the developing of heavy industries or you look at industrialization as a whole was to connect with the private sectors as opposed to a pure planned economy. And I think Taiwan's shift to export-led industrialization and also Taiwan's loss in the international community. Taiwan lost its seats in international community make a big difference. That participating in international trade was crucial, and developing heavy industry was partly to bring that technology spill over to the other industries. So I think it's quite different. And even if you look at the current initiatives, it's not just about building those military capacities and defense capacity, but it's really about bring the spill over either forward or backward. And I think that's the difference. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Let's thank our panel. Thank you very much. Thanks for getting up so early.